Authorities in Los Angeles have been giving more details about their investigation into the deaths of the actor Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy Arakawa.
The secret of Egyptian granite cutting may finally be solved. Graham Hancock. Inside the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid, the walls and ceiling are built from massive blocks of red granite, some weighing well over 50 tons apiece. The joints between them are cut so tightly that in places you can barely slide a piece of paper into the seam. Above that chamber, hidden from public view, sit several additional relieving chambers, also roofed with enormous granite beams, a detail most visitors never see, but one that has fascinated engineers for well over a century. For more than 100 years, that precision has sat at the center of one of Egyptology's most persistent arguments, not about whether the ancient Egyptians built these structures, which no serious researcher disputes, but about exactly how they managed to cut and finish a stone that even modern industrial tools find genuinely difficult. This is a story about that argument, who's making which claims, what's actually been tested, and where the real, unresolved questions still sit. Why granite is a different problem than limestone. Most of what makes up the Giza pyramids is limestone, and limestone is a relatively forgiving material. It's soft enough to be cut with copper tools alone, and archaeologists have a fairly complete picture of how it was quarried, moved, and stacked using ramps, sledges, levers, and enormous coordinated labor forces. The debate over limestone construction methods still has open details, but nobody seriously argues that the material itself presented an insurmountable technical barrier. Granite is a different story. It's an igneous rock made up largely of quartz, feldspar, and mica, and its quartz content sits at roughly a 7 on the Mohs hardness scale. Hard enough that cutting it today typically requires diamond-tipped blades, water cooling systems, and industrial-grade equipment. Even with all of that modern technology, granite remains slow and expensive to machine. That's exactly why the granite elements at Giza, the King's Chamber, sections of the Valley Temple, various sarcophagi, and a scattering of statues and vessels, have drawn so much more sustained engineering scrutiny than the limestone core of the pyramids themselves. The official explanation, and where it came from. The traditional Egyptological answer to how this granite was worked has 3 basic components: copper tools, sand used as an abrasive, and dolerite hammerstones used for pounding and roughing out shapes, combined with a very large amount of time and skilled labor. This explanation isn't a modern guess pulled out of thin air. It traces back to the work of Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie, the British archaeologist often credited as one of the founders of scientific Egyptology. In the late 1800s, Petrie examined granite artifacts, including drilled cores and sawn blocks, and proposed that copper tools combined with an abrasive powder could account for what he was seeing. Notably, Petrie himself entertained the idea that the abrasive involved might have included something harder than ordinary sand. He specifically considered corundum, along with a handful of other hard minerals, as a possible candidate, though he lacked the tools to confirm it. For much of the 20th century, that basic framework held as the working consensus, even as the specific details of the abrasive used remained somewhat unsettled. Putting the theory to the test, Dennis Stocks, the person most responsible for actually testing the copper and sand explanation under controlled conditions, was Dennis Stocks, a British experimental archaeologist who combined a background in mechanical engineering and technology teaching with decades of hands-on fieldwork in Egypt. Rather than simply arguing about the theory from a desk, Stocks built and used reconstructed ancient tools, copper saws, copper tube drills, dolerite pounders, and tested them directly against granite and other hard stones, much of it in collaboration with archaeological teams working in Aswan. His results, published across several decades and collected in his book, Experiments in Egyptian Archaeology, Stoneworking Technology in Ancient Egypt, demonstrated that copper tools combined with sand, abrasive genuinely could cut, saw, and drill granite, including producing spiral-groove drill cores comparable in general appearance to the ones Petrie had recovered generations earlier. This body of work is why the copper and sand explanation isn't simply an assumption. There's real, published, peer-reviewed experimental data behind at least the basic mechanical plausibility of the method. But it's worth being precise about what Stocks' experiments actually showed, because this is where a lot of online retellings, on both sides of the debate, tend to overstate their case. Stock's own results came with real limitations. Cutting and drilling granite this way was slow, producing a single drilled hole comparable to ancient examples required, by his own account, thousands of rotations and a substantial investment of time and physical effort. His experiments demonstrated feasibility, not effortlessness, and he did not claim to have replicated every extreme example of precision and finish documented across every granite artifact in Egypt. Some of the most demanding surfaces, extremely flat faces on the largest blocks, for instance, remain harder to fully account for using his specific experimental data alone. Where Graham Hancock enters the picture. This is the gap that Graham Hancock has spent decades pointing to. Hancock is a British writer and journalist, not a trained archaeologist, who has published books on ancient civilizations since the early 1990s, including Fingerprints of the Gods, and who more recently presented the Netflix documentary series Ancient Apocalypse. His broader thesis, that an advanced lost prehistoric civilization existed before the end of the last ice age and influenced later cultures around the world, is a genuinely fringe position within professional archaeology, rejected by the overwhelming majority of specialists in the field, and that broader claim is a separate discussion from the narrower granite cutting question on the specific issue of granite working. However, Hancock's argument is narrower and somewhat more defensible on its own terms. He contends that mainstream Egyptology has been too quick to treat the copper and sand explanation as fully settled, when in fact certain surfaces and drill cores, particularly some of Petrie's original finds, still present feed rates, tolerances, and finish qualities that haven't been comprehensively reproduced or explained by the existing experimental record. He argues that dismissing these open questions, rather than continuing to test them, reflects institutional complacency rather than a genuinely closed case. A manufacturing engineer's perspective. Chris Dunn. Hancock isn't the only person raising this question, and he isn't raising it purely from a historical or archaeological background. Chris Dunn spent more than 4 decades working as a manufacturing engineer, largely in aerospace and precision industrial contexts, before turning his professional attention to ancient Egyptian stonework. In several published books, most notably The Giza Power Plant and Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt, Dunn has argued that specific granite artifacts, including certain sarcophagi and architectural elements, display flatness and surface finish that he believes exceed what hand tools and abrasive slurries can reasonably produce within the timeframes conventionally assumed for their construction. Dunn's claims have drawn substantial and detailed pushback from professional Egyptologists, geologists, and other engineers, many of whom argue that his measurements, his methodology for assessing flatness, and his interpretation of tool marks don't hold up under closer scrutiny, and that his conclusions don't adequately account for the scale of organized, skilled labor available to a centralized ancient state capable of mobilizing tens of thousands of workers over the course of a reign. His work remains controversial and is generally treated as a minority position outside of professional archaeology, but it has helped keep the underlying engineering question, rather than the more speculative lost civilization question, alive as a point of genuine technical discussion. The corundum question, honestly stated. A significant amount of online discussion around this topic centers on corundum, the mineral family that includes ruby and sapphire, sitting near the very top of the Mohs hardness scale, just below diamond. It's worth stating plainly, corundum is not a fringe or invented concept in this discussion. Ground corundum, historically known as emery, has a long, well-documented history as an abrasive across the ancient Mediterranean and Near East, and as mentioned earlier, Petrie himself raised the possibility that Egyptian craftsmen might have used a corundum-based or similarly hard abrasive as far back as the 1880s. What remains genuinely unresolved is direct, verified, published archaeological evidence, residue actually recovered from ancient cutting grooves, analyzed under modern instrumentation, such as scanning electron microscopy or energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, and confirmed through peer review, establishing that corundum was the specific abrasive used at Giza at the scale required to shape structures like the King's Chamber. That specific, decisive piece of evidence has not been established in the peer-reviewed literature. Claims that circulate suggesting such a discovery was made in 2022 by a named material scientist, followed by controlled 2023 workshop trials that definitively prove the method do not correspond to any published, verifiable research. Versions of this exact narrative, often with a different scientist's name attached from one retelling to the next, have circulated widely online without ever being traceable to an actual study, institution, or peer-reviewed publication. That's a meaningful distinction, because it's easy to mistake a well-produced narrative for settled science when neither the underlying study nor the scientist behind it can actually be verified. Why the debate gets personal. Hancock has said publicly more than once that he believes his lack of formal archaeological credentials has been used by segments of the field to dismiss his arguments without engaging with the underlying specifics. That objections are sometimes directed at him personally rather than at the individual pieces of evidence he raises. There's some truth to the pattern he's describing. Professional archaeology, like most academic fields, can be resistant to outsiders challenging established frameworks, regardless of the merit of any specific claim. At the same time, mainstream Egyptologists and archaeologists have a legitimate counterargument of their own. They point out that Hancock has a track record of overstating how unresolved certain questions actually are, of using dramatic framing, impossible, nobody can explain it, the mystery is solved, for issues that do, in fact, have published experimental work behind them, even when that work is incomplete rather than absent entirely. From their perspective, the frustration isn't with outsiders asking questions. It's with claims that skip past decades of real experimental archaeology, like Stock's work, in order to present the field as having done nothing at all. Both of these things can be true simultaneously. Real, published experimentation has been done, and it has real limitations. Legitimate, still open questions exist about the most extreme examples of precision, and some corners of the online debate, on both the mystery solved side and the nothing has ever been tested side, routinely overstate their case in ways that don't reflect the actual state of the research. What's actually known, and what genuinely isn't. So where does that leave things, stated as plainly as possible? We know ancient Egyptian craftsmen worked granite at a scale and in specific instances, a level of precision that required real technical skill, careful tool design, and an enormous, well-organized labor force. We know copper tools combined with sand abrasive can cut and drill granite, because Dennis Stocks demonstrated this experimentally, repeatedly, over decades of fieldwork. We know that method, as tested, was slow and labor-intensive, and that it hasn't been conclusively shown to account for every documented surface, particularly some of the flattest and most tightly fitted examples. We know corundum-based abrasives were understood and used in parts of the ancient world, and that Petrie himself speculated about their possible use in Egypt more than a century ago. But we do not have confirmed, peer-reviewed physical evidence pinning down corundum as the specific abrasive used at Giza. What we don't have is a single, universally accepted final answer that closes the conversation, despite how frequently that claim gets made, in one direction or the other, across social media and video platforms. The granite chambers of Giza remain a case where the physical evidence is real, the disagreement among qualified people is real, and the honest answer is that the picture is still being filled in through the patient, unglamorous, and often quite slow work of building tools, running experiments, and comparing measured results. The same kind of work Stocks was doing decades before this became a recurring online argument, and the same kind of work that any credible resolution of the corundum question will eventually require. A broader lesson, if there is one. If there's a genuine takeaway here, it may have less to do with ancient Egypt, specifically, and more to do with how we tend to handle unresolved technical questions in general. There's a strong pull toward wanting a dramatic, final answer. Either the mystery has been solved, or the establishment has been hiding the truth for 100 years. The more accurate and admittedly less satisfying picture is that serious, credentialed people on more than one side of this argument are still actively working the problem, using real tools, real experimental replication, and real professional disagreement. That is, in most fields, roughly what it looks like while a genuine scientific question remains open, not a conspiracy, and not a settled case, but an ongoing, evidence-driven argument that hasn't finished yet. What do you think actually explains the finish on the most extreme granite surfaces at Giza? Refined technique with familiar materials, or something in the toolkit we haven't fully pinned down yet? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you'd rather get the grounded, verifiable version of stories like this instead of the version built for clicks, stay with the channel. There's more of this ahead.